A couple of things that Julie said there at the beginning. I'm a Coach Club member, but I didn't make it to one of my 3 offices to get my Coach Club pin to get on my jacket. So I neglected to do that today. But she said that the purpose of the John Bell Society, the Coach Club Society, is to protect, preserve, and educate. And those are words that are very important to me. I've spent my life trying to protect historic structures and places of history and importance. I've definitely tried to educate people on that and work to preserve them at the same time. So those are 3 words that are really valuable to me. And I would recommend that you join the Coach Club and join us and help us preserve this legacy. So without further ado, I'll get into the program. I've got to give you a little bit. Oh, I need to tell you this too. Underneath taped underneath your chairs, there is a notebook for you to take notes in, and there's going to be a 50-question essay test at the end of the program. Because I'm a history professor, and school starts tomorrow, so I'm going to get a day early and get a test in before everybody else does on campus. So be prepared for that. I'm joking, right? Okay, so let's talk about Van Buren, and I could give you the whole history of Van Buren. I wrote a book about it, but I'm just going to kind of focus on really from 1820 till about 1912, and then we'll make some generalizations. But that's that's close to the area that John's paintings cover. So in 1820, Crawford County was established, and a lot of people don't know, but it was named for William H. Crawford. He was from Georgia, and he was the Secretary of Treasury in those days for Andrew Jackson. And we almost we would have had a President Crawford had he not become ill. He's an interesting story. He got sick and had to bow out of the political race, but he probably, instead of Martin Van Buren, he probably would have won the presidency had his health been a little bit better. In 1818, before Crawford County was even established, a guy named Thomas Martin showed up, and he ends up on the property. He came after a man named Boyd, who was there even before that. But really, it's the Phillips. It's James Phillips and then his 2 sons, Thomas and David, in the 1820s and 1830s, who actually secure the land. They get deed to pretty much all the property that's now the downtown area of Van Buren. And they sit on it for a while, but they don't do a whole lot. They operate a wood lot, and they're selling firewood. They're cutting timber and selling it to the steamboats going up and down the river. And along in 1836, John Drennen, who's kind of important to me in my career and in the university, he and his brother-in-law David Thompson show up. Thompson is from Delaware and Drennen is from Pennsylvania, so these are not Arkansas guys, but they've come here. Remember, our license plates used to say land of what? Opportunity. And that's what these guys were looking for, and they were early at it. And they bought out Thomas and David Phillips for $11,000. And they ended up with 600 acres that's now the downtown area of Van Buren. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in just a second. In the 1830s to the 1850s, Van Buren and Fort Smith on this side of the river is a major conduit on the Trail of Tears. So that's part of our history. I took some folks yesterday to the Cherokee Nation over in Tahlequah, to the headquarters, and we toured museums and things. Their history is our history. And the Cherokees were first moved to what is today Arkansas before they were moved over there. So we have a very important relationship, especially with the Cherokee Nation. In 1845, the town was incorporated. In 1849, Fort Smith and Van Buren. But Van Buren, yeah. Okay, here we go. In the 1840s, Van Buren was a bigger town than Fort Smith, folks. It was more affluent. There was more commerce. There was more economic development. It was a bigger town. And that's important to understand, okay? The other thing is, in the 1830s, 1840s, Fort Smith was in Crawford County. Did you know that? Now you know, okay. So anyway, the gold rush brought a lot of people traveling west through here. So you always hear about Kansas City and you hear about places up north being the gateway to the west during the gold rush. Van Buren and Fort Smith in western Arkansas was another gateway. The Interstate 40 corridor was the best way to get to California, even in the 1800s. And we could talk about the railroad and why it didn't get built there, but there was that little thing called the Civil War that we talk about sometimes. And that's why they built the railroad a little bit further north. But a long story there. Here's another one for you that's very important. In 1851, the federal court for the Western District of Arkansas, does that sound familiar? Was established in Van Buren in Crawford County. And for 20 years, it was in Van Buren. Did you know that? A lot of people don't know that. There were hangings in Van Buren. They held the most notorious outlaw that they ever held in Van Buren, and he eventually escaped from the jail in Van Buren, a guy that you've heard of named Wyatt Earp. How about that? Okay, that all happened in Van Buren. 1858, the Butterfield Stage. The Butterfield Stage had an east-west route from Memphis through Little Rock to Van Buren, and a north-south route from St. Louis all the way to Van Buren. And it crossed the river at Van Buren, Arkansas, came over here to Fort Smith, and then headed to California. Okay, so the Butterfield Stage comes right through here also, and that's a part of the story. Yeah, 1871, that federal court that started in Van Buren moved to Fort Smith. And here's the other thing, since I'm on both sides of the river, in 1871, Fort Smith, that's when Fort Smith's star rises. Okay, that federal court brought economic development, brought a lot of activity, lawyers, people that they were bringing people from all over the country to serve on juries here. That served the hotel industry, advancement. All schools expanded, the hospitals got built. All that stuff is connected to the economic engine that the federal court was, and it left Van Buren and came over here, and that's the way things go. From the 1870s on, Fort Smith kind of leaves Van Buren size-wise and development-wise kind of in the dust. And Van Buren stays the kind of quaint little town that it still kind of is today, and Fort Smith's 4 or 5 times larger. So that's important to understand too. In 1876, the railroad was established from Little Rock to Van Buren, and then they had a ferry. They had a ferry boat that carried 5 train cars. And they would bring a train into Van Buren from Little Rock, and they would disconnect 5 cars and take them to the Fort Smith side and come back and forth till they got the whole train assembled in Fort Smith. That wasn't a very good plan, So in 1885, about 10 years later, they built the bridge, and the railroad bridge that's there today has been remodeled and adjusted over the years. But it's where those piers are the original 1885 piers for the railroad bridge between Van Buren and Fort Smith. So that dates to the 1870s and into the 1880s. The Frisco Railroad comes in the early 80s. They build that bridge, and it's completed in 1886. And then, like I said, it was remodeled in 1913 and 1941. In 1892, there was a Union Depot built in Van Buren that served the Fort Smith and Little Rock Railroad. I always call it the Fort Smith and Little Rock Railroad. I don't want to call it the Little Rock and Fort Smith Railroad. I'm kind of stubborn that way. And the Frisco, the 2 main railroads in Van Buren. In 1890s, of course, they get water and electricity. The Drennen House is one of the first houses in Van Buren to get electricity, and I have a 1890s light fixture in there. That's really neat. In 1901, 1902, the Frisco Depot that we're going to talk about today is built. 1908, Main Street gets paved. So it's 1908 before you're not stepping in the mud and all the other wonderful things that are floating around out there in the rain. And then in 1912, the Free Bridge, which is the Midland Avenue Bridge, or whatever you want to call that. Of course, it's not that same bridge. That bridge that's out there today between the 2 communities dates to the 60s. But the one that was originally there was built in 1912. I'm going to show you a picture of that. And the other thing I like to say is that Van Buren has always, and I noticed this when I wrote the pictorial history of Van Buren has always been connected to transportation. That's been the theme of the community. And it started out as a river town. It became a railroad town. And today it's right there on Interstate 40. You got to come off 40 and travel quite a ways to get to Fort Smith. But Van Buren is right on the interstate. So it's still very important in terms of transportation today. So there's your timeline. And in the middle of that, from probably somewhere around here, well, actually the Crawford County Courthouse is up into here. But from here down is the John Bell era for the topic of his paintings. I mentioned John Drennen to you, and I can't talk to you about Van Buren at all without talking about the founder of the community. John was a very amazing man. He's a man that has flaws. He's a product of the 19th century. He owned slaves. He was government agent during the Trail of Tears. We have to put him in context. We have to understand the not so good. And the good things he did, he gave the county the square block that the courthouse is sitting on. So we're going to talk about the Crawford County Courthouse in just a second. And the land for that spot was given by him to the county, donated. Well, he sold it to him for $1. We have the copy of the deed in the collection. But he did a lot of good. His fingerprints are on a lot of things in Van Buren and in western Arkansas for that matter. And probably the most important thing that he did in his life was he was tasked with paying the Cherokees out after the Trail of Tears. I wish I could give you a whole Cherokee history class today and have you come back and just keep coming back for other lessons. But the thing I want to say is the Cherokees signed a treaty, gave up their lands, and the federal government agreed to pay them. Well, you know what happened? The federal government didn't pay them for 25 years. But the Cherokees hired lawyers and had lawyers, and they fought all the way through the court system. It took them 25 years to get to the Supreme Court. And you know what the Supreme Court said when they got that case? Hey, the federal government owes the Cherokees money, and they need to be paid. John Drennen was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the region at that time, and he's the one who carried that out. So he paid the Cherokees. And in doing so, he did a census on the people that deserved that payment. And those people, those names are the original signers and families a part of the treaty. So that's a very important piece of Cherokee family heritage and history today. And you can prove your ancestry if your family's name's on the Drennen roll, which he did. So that's real important there too. So I got to mention him, and you can't mention him without mentioning his house. We were talking about the oldest courthouse, one of the oldest functioning county courthouses west of the Mississippi, one of them, a little while ago. Well, we have the oldest house in Van Buren that was first constructed in 1838. Okay, oldest home in Van Buren, and consequently the oldest building in Fort Smith is the commissary building at the National Historic Site, also constructed in 1838. So oldest, that's 1838 is a big year for all of us. There's the Free Bridge being dedicated and open. Interestingly, the Free Bridge, the pedestrian bridge between Van Buren and Fort Smith, first had a drop bridge in it, and the railroad bridge didn't have that raising and lowering bridge in the section there. Today, the railroad bridge has it, and the pedestrian bridge doesn't. But sometimes those photographs get confused. But there were airplanes flying around in 1912 commemorating the bridge being built and all that. That's kind of cool. I want to point out a few things here. This is a perspective map. There's one of these for Fort Smith too, and I think the Fort Smith map is 1887, and the Van Buren map was done a year later. But the land, by the way, that's the Drennen house right there. There's the railroad bridge. The other bridges didn't exist yet in the 1880s. But John Drennen bought a piece of land that roughly extended to about there, about 600 acres, and by 1888, it was a bustling city, and that's his influence in town. All those buildings, of course, that we're going to talk about are on Main Street. The depot was up here at the top of the street. Here's the Crawford County Courthouse, the King Opera House we're going to talk about, which she didn't mention today. There's a reason for that, because Ram doesn't have one in the collection yet. We need to get one, don't we? Yes, we do. But anyway, there's Main Street. There's John Drennen's house. UA Fort Smith's very fortunate because we also acquired the Wilhoff house, and it's right here. So this map is pretty fun. But again, it also shows you the river town, the railroad town with the railroad tracks, and then what's going to come later is over the hill is the interstate. So we're going to start with the Crawford County Courthouse. The Crawford County Courthouse was built originally, started construction in 1841, completed in 1842, okay? From 1851 to 1871, I already mentioned this, but it housed the federal court for the Western District of Arkansas, which eventually moved to Fort Smith in 1871, and a guy named Isaac C. Parker shows up, and you know that story. So there you go, all that happened. I have a letter that I found doing research where John Drennen, as Indian agent, was in a dispute, and he was arguing on behalf of the Choctaw Nation because the Choctaw had been a victim of a crime by someone from the Creek Nation. And the Choctaw Nation wanted to prosecute the Creek Indian for the crime. And the Creek Nation said, we prosecute our own people. And the Choctaw Nation's not touching him with a 10-foot pole. And they were in this big dispute as to who was going to punish who and what was going to happen. And John Drennen said, he wrote to his boss in Washington, D.C., and he said, boss, we need a court out here. We need a federal court to deal with cases when Indians from one tribe commit crimes against another, and then they can deal with it. Because in those days, a Choctaw could only prosecute a Choctaw. Does that make sense? That each tribe could only deal with their own people. There was no way to deal with them outside of tribal boundaries. Drennen writes a letter in 1849, 1850, and a year later, 1851, they established a court in Van Buren. I think that's kind of interesting. So he was kind of prophetic there. The courthouse burned in 1877. It was arson. I have some suspicions about that, but we probably don't have time to go into it. But the federal court at Van Buren was somewhat corrupt, at least. I say that word loosely. there was a lot of stuff going on under the table. And they kind of skipped town in Van Buren. They brought some of that. You talk to Brandon Goldsmith and some of the stuff that he's been doing over here on this side of the river. He talks about how that court arrived over here under kind of sneaky circumstances and suspect. But that's kind of interesting. When the courthouse burned, Alma stepped up and said, "We'll take the county seat if nobody wants it." Alma and Van Buren have always been in a lot of competition. They still are, so that's kind of fun. The four walls were still standing after the fire. So from the four walls, they rebuilt the courthouse. And I'm going to show you how that looks in a minute. They added a clock tower at that time. In 1905, they added some side wings in the portico, which you're going to see in the John Bell painting. And also in 1940, a rear addition was added. So let's go through some historic photos. Here's what the original courthouse looked like. Okay, so this is the 1841-42 courthouse. You notice it has a pretty substantial fence around it. That was, what do we do? Why do we build fences today? To keep things in or out? Most people use them to keep things in, don't they? Keep your kids in there, keep your cows in there, keep your chickens in there. Okay. Back then it was to keep things out. Okay. They didn't want all the livestock and wild animals flowing through the courthouse grounds, so they built a fence around it, and you didn't get in there unless you had a reason. So that's kind of fun. So here's the original courthouse, and that's not a bell tower. That's just a cupola up there. It's a cupola. There's nothing in there. It's just kind of empty. And then after the fire, they build it back from the four walls, and the architecture changes a little bit from the fire, but they add a clock tower. There's a Seth Thomas clock up there in there, and that clock's still there. So. It dodged the tornado that was there recently. So this is post 1878 here. They still got a fence up to keep stuff out of there, but that's the difference. So I'm gonna go back and forth here for just a second. There's the original courthouse. There's the 1878 reconstruction after the fire. I love this. This is by William Cushenberry. He was a resident of Crawford County, lived in Van Buren and in Fort Smith, was a contemporary of John Drennan and Drennan's son-in-law, Charles Scott. But he drew this. This is a neat kind of picture of the Crawford County Courthouse, probably in the 1870s. And you can kind of see some activity there in Van Buren. Just a sketch, but I love this. I use this quite often because I just love the perspective of it. Here's the wings that were added with the portico. Probably 4th of July, I'm guessing, because of all the bunting and the American flags. But there's so you can see your original four walls, and you can see they added onto it, and you can also see the portico with the columns. And our art education director was discussing that earlier too. These are Confederate veterans in front of that portico, or actually I think they're on the north side of the building. But this is Confederate veterans probably in the 1880s or 1890s after the war. There in front of the Crawford County Courthouse. A little bit shows you some of the uses and things that were going on. A little bit of the detail of the windows. And then one of the neat things that's on the ground there and has been there for a significant number of years is the Hebe statue. Hebe is the Greek goddess. And her statue has been there, been redone a few times and had some damage. But one of the things that exists a lot in the photographs of Van Buren, I always see a lot of people, her picture's been made up plenty of times. And there are a lot of photographs of her in the collection. I really like these kids, these boys and kids hanging out. And I always love to know who those guys were. They even drug some chairs out to sit in while they got their picture made. I like that. And then here's the last historical image I want to show you, because this is kind of the perspective that it's from the opposite side, but this is what John Bell painted. So here's the courthouse around the time that John Bell painted it, and the Hebe statue is actually over here outside of the view of the photograph. And I want to point some things out to you as you look at it, a little bit bigger version than what she showed you. We do know there was a gazebo on the lawn, and I read newspaper articles and accounts of the gazebo. Bands played there. John Philip Sousa played in that gazebo at one time. Marched his band down Main Street and took up there in the bandstand and played a concert there on the lawn. That's a really cool story. Here's the Confederate statue with Samuel Clark up there at the top of it, and you got Hebe over here in her fountain, and then you can actually see up Main Street, which we'll talk about more in a little bit. But the clock tower, you can see the wings and the portico and all the features of the building there. So there's the Crawford County Courthouse for you. And
the fence is now gone.
Huh?
The fence is now gone.
The fence is gone. They weren't worried about that much anymore. And you've got some food trucks out there on the side too. So, things never change, right? We're going to move to the Frisco Depot next. The Frisco Depot is going to be built in the 1890s, dates to that time period. The freight depot was first, and there was a freight depot on that site, and then they tore it down and they built the passenger depot between 1901 and 1902. Okay, so that's something that's important to understand. So they operated freight up there, and the passenger depot was actually down on the other side of the courthouse, down closer to the river in the early days. It was in operation until the 1960s, so you're going to see some photographs that kind of show it in its heyday all the way into its twilight years. It's a Mediterranean-style depot, the type of architecture that it is built with. So it has a red tile roof. It has wide overhanging eaves, and there are triangular braces under the eaves. So there's some architectural features to look for as we look at these photographs. This is going to be probably in the 1900s here, early 1900s. My understanding is these are peaches from Crawford County. They're coming to the depot to be loaded. This is not the perspective. This is the south end of the depot, not the north end of the depot. So in the John Bell painting, you're on the other side of the building looking this way, and we're looking towards the perspective of where John's painting was, which you'll see in just a minute. Does that make sense? Yeah, you're at the other end of the building. And it's funny because most of the pictures I have historically that I've been able to find are from that perspective, not from the one that he chose. That would be a question. John, why'd you paint it from that end of the building instead of this end of the building? Because all the historic photos are from this end. That's something the historian would like to ask. Again, this is from the south end of the building or the west end of the building. This is going to be probably pretty close to when. This may even be the dedication. I've never seen a definition for this painting or photograph, but the people are all dressed up, very nice. The women are they have more formal wear. They have their hats and their long skirts and everything. The men are all wearing coats and ties. So this is a special occasion of some sort, and it's probably around the time that the building was completed. But can you see? I described the tile roof. So you've got these tiles. You've got these big triangular braces underneath these wide eaves, so that you see it all right there. The architecture is pretty clear, and John did the same thing in his painting. He was totally true to the architecture. I love his attention to detail. The historian in me loves that part of the legacy that he left us. This is probably in the 30s. Those are some 30s model cars with some 20s model cars, and even a very early bus right there in the foreground. Again, you're at the west or southern end, looking back towards the depot. You can kind of see the detail on the tile roof a little bit more, and you can see how wide those eaves are on each side, the covered area, so that they're unloading stuff and waiting for the train and keeping stuff dry, I guess, would be the purpose in that. But I really like, this is kind of a rare picture. You don't see this one very often in Van Buren. We're moving up into the 60s here. Same perspective as you just saw, but we're looking at it from the railroad track side of the building, so you get to see where the railroad line. And today, the excursion train for A&M Railroad pulls up right there where you're looking and loads and unloads passengers. But again, you can see the triangular braces. You can see the red tile roof, even though it's not color. And you see some 60s era pickup trucks. That's about a 64 Chevy right there. And you have the depot's about to be, fade into mothballs for a while until the city of Van Buren comes back and turns it into a small museum and visitor center for the city, which is what it is today. So here's the depot, painted in 1992. From the other end, so you're on the east end or the north end, however you want to view that. Probably the northeast end is the most accurate. A couple of things that we like to point out. You can see the brick streets. So this is part of Main Street right here, and it's brick. There were some buildings. Today, this area here is Freedom Park. So Van Buren has built a park area and Veterans Park, and they have covered area for farmers market, and they do a bunch of Christmas lighting and things up there at Christmas time. Lots of neat uses for that. They have one of the splash pads for kids to enjoy. But that's where you're at. And somebody asked, well, Donnie Young, okay? So Donnie Young is a Van Buren personality and investment banker and person over there. And she actually talked to John about this painting when he did it. And she asked him, she said, I don't remember there being railroad tracks on the Main Street side of the depot. What's going on here, John? And he said, oh, I'll tell you that story. He said one of their carts was heavily loaded at one point and was pointed this way and rolled off, and it was so heavy that it cut into the bricks right here. And for many years there were bricks. Now he painted railroad tracks here, so he's got you pointing this way. I think that's a trick. But he explained the outline of the tracks from a cart that got out of hand and dented and broke those bricks. And they didn't go in and replace them. So that was his explanation for why he did that. Now, he does have tracks here, so that was kind of funny. But anyway, those are the things I wanted to say. He painted the triangular braces. He got the red tile roof, perfect, and really a neat. Probably in 1930. He's painting in 1930s with the steam engine and the cars that you see. 1930s view here. Maybe even World War II with a soldier. But there you go, 30s or 40s. All right. And you can see all these except for the King Opera House I'm going to show you are upstairs. So you can go linger and look long up there. I'm going to show them to you and move on. But anyway, that's the plan today. Okay, so the next painting is the Crawford County Bank Building. And this is down in the middle of Main Street. It was built in 1889. It's a Queen Anne style. That's the architectural style. So it has a corner turret. It has some terracotta features and some really intricate brick detailing. It also has patterned slate shingles on the third floor, which we'll look at and be able to see in the painting in a minute. It was the first bank to open after the Civil War. Of course, Van Buren was in Arkansas, and Arkansas was a Confederate state, and banking and finance and economic development was drastically disrupted by the Civil War, and it took years to recover. You could also make the argument we're still recovering from the Civil War. Mississippi still is too. Tennessee and Alabama, all the southern states have worked to get back up to the level that they had before the war. The third floor, interestingly enough, was the hall for the International Order of Oddfellows, and Oddfellows is kind of like, I don't want to say like Masons, but they're a fraternal organization, men's club, and Oddfellows is just another one of those. You can always find the Oddfellows because it usually says it on their tombstones, on their gravestones in the cemetery. So they met upstairs too. So here's some historic photos of the Crawford County Bank Building, and it's Van Buren's most iconic building probably, and the city of Van Buren's used that image and that outline of that building for years for their logo and different things. So very, very iconic. But you've got the turret, and you can see the intricate brickwork and the terracotta, and that third floor is where the Oddfellows met and all the stuff that's going on there. Here's I found this photograph on the web, and I just snatched it because I'm an educator and I can do that, I guess. I'm not going to sell it. I'm just going to show it. But somebody really went to some serious photography work here to get those clouds just right and get the colors right. But that building just really pops at you. And this is pretty recent. Those are newer model cars like we drive today there in the parking area. So this is probably pretty recent. But there's that building too, and you can see some of the details there. And then this was another perspective from the other end of the building and the Citizens Bank building is next door to it. So we're not going to talk about it, but it was there were two banks side by side right there, the Crawford County Bank and the Citizens Bank. And then there's a different perspective of some of that detail work. And there it is back here a little ways. So you're up Main Street towards the depot, looking down at it, but there's your building right there. This is in the 1930s or 40s, according to the cars. And then here's John Bell's version with the trolley. A lot of people know very much about the trolley in Fort Smith, but the trolley had service in Van Buren also. And Aunt Caroline, who's John Drenna's great-granddaughter, she worked at the Boston store over here on Garrison Avenue, and she rode the trolley from Van Buren all the way up Midland Avenue to Electric Park, and then she changed trolleys and rode all the way to downtown to get to work. When the trolley quit running, she rode a bus. But she left us some stories and some things about that. I found her Boston store name tags in the house at the Drennen house. And that was special to me because I worked at the Boston store when it was at Central Mall. So that's kind of fun. But here's John Bell's Crawford County Bank building. Again, around the turn of the century, by the clothing, by the use of the trolley, and what we know on Main Street right there. Beautiful picture. The next painting we're going to talk about is a perspective of Main Street, and he gave us an image up Main Street that kind of covers of the city, and Main Street's considered the heart of the city. Most Main Streets are. We have Main Street programming in Arkansas to restore and preserve and conserve these very important places. You know, it's funny. Main Streets were where everything happened, and then somewhere somebody got the mall idea, and they built malls, and everything shifted to one building, and that was really neat. And I remember Phoenix Village Mall, and I remember Central Mall growing up, but it just didn't have the same feel as downtown does. And you know, it seems like today we're clawing our way back to downtown, and we're trying to revitalize and do all that. It's a shame that we even had to do that, but anyway, it's the heart of the city, considered that. In 1862, something most people don't know is the Union Army invaded Van Buren after Prairie Grove, after the Battle of Northwest Arkansas. They chased all the Confederates out of Van Buren to the Fort Smith side of the river. They had an artillery duel across the river at Van Buren, between Fort Smith and Van Buren, and they paraded on their third day in town. 8,000 Union soldiers walked right down Main Street, and the generals were standing on the courthouse lawn at Crawford County Courthouse watching them march by that day. And then they hung around for a few days. They burned some steamboats, destroyed some cotton, dumped a bunch of corn in the Arkansas River so the Confederate Army wouldn't have anything to eat. And then they hightailed it back to Northwest Arkansas. And they took about 1,000 slaves with them, because it was merely days before the Emancipation Proclamation took effect. And those slaves said, "We're get out of here early." And they left with the Union Army and went north and got their freedom. The Strawberry Festival Parade is something that happens. I'm going to show you a photograph of that in a minute. But that's something that was a big deal on Main Street for many, many years. Crawford County, Arkansas used to be the strawberry capital of the universe, folks. A lot of people don't know that. Crawford County, Arkansas led the nation in strawberry growth at one time. Most of that stuff ended up in California and further west, where the growing season is a lot longer. But Van Buren, Crawford County, up to Cedarville, over towards Mulberry, that was strawberry country for many, many years. And that's important too. You're going to see the brick pavers, the brick streets. And originally Main Street went all the way to the river. Well, it still kind of does today, but you got to go through Simmons chicken processing plant to get there now. So that's not always fun. So this is almost the same perspective that John Bell chose in his painting, which I think is kind of interesting. I wonder, another question I would have for him as a historian, did you look at that picture and then decide to paint the perspective that you painted? Because it's pretty close. You're going to see the similarities here in a minute. But he's actually a little bit further down Main Street in his painting. But you can see the depot. There's the depot we talked about earlier up there at the top of Main Street. And then you're looking north or northeast here, and you can kind of see the town. This is before automobiles. So you've got wagons and carriages and bicycles and those wonderful, pork pie straw hats and all kinds of fun stuff going on there. My understanding is this is a Liberty Bond parade on Main Street. Somebody took this out of a window up in one of the buildings, probably somewhere around the area that first photograph was taken, about the same length of the street there. But you can see again the depot up in the top of the photograph in the left corner. And then you've got Army trucks and vehicles dating to the World War II period. And you've got 40s era automobiles parked along the street. And then you got people enjoying the Liberty Bond parade on both sides. And photographs like this are awesome because usually the detail is really excellent, and you can zoom in on those advertisements and signage on the buildings, and you can figure out who was where and what was going on in all those buildings, because that changes over time. Here's another perspective, even closer to the one that he painted. Again, before the automobile era, so we're probably talking about right around the turn of the century. You can see the streets are I believe that's brick, right? That looks like brick to me. There's a regular pattern there. So these are brick streets, and that's an indication of the time, and there's some signage and stuff going on. And then here's one more, even further back. And what you're looking at, I'll go ahead and show you. This is the iron fence that replaced the wooden fence around the courthouse. So the courthouse is right here, and this is the fence around the courthouse square block, and all that's gone today. But this raised area, you step up on the retaining wall still today. That stone retaining wall is still along that sidewalk. But here's your view. Here's the depot way up Main Street now, and you're quite a ways further closer to the river, right with the courthouse to your right there. I think this is part of this is actually before this is a parade, but I don't know which one it is. But what's really cool is this is F.G. Herr's drugstore on Main Street right here. And we excavated, Arkansas Archaeological Survey excavated pill bottles and glass pharmaceutical bottles for medicine from F.G. Herr's pharmacy at the Drennen House. So we know they were trading with F.G. Herr when they got sick and needed something. So that's kind of fun. I wanted to show you that picture. You don't see much of Main Street. You see the bricks. It's paved. You can see the trolley tracks, but I think the trolley tracks. And then you're looking at the west side of the street. The depot would be up there in the far right end of the picture. And I have one picture of a strawberry parade. This is Lady Liberty being driven by Henry Faber, who ran a grocery store on Main Street. I didn't know Henry Faber. He was long gone by the time I got here, but I knew his daughter. And she lived into her 90s, and she passed in 2019, right before COVID hit. And she lived her whole life pretty much in Chicago. She was a Faber, and her father ran the grocery store in town. But she moved to Chicago when she was a young lady and learned piano. She studied piano at the University of Chicago and became a piano teacher. Met a man in Chicago, married, and stayed up there. But she got the Crawford County Courier, and what eventually became the Press Argus Courier, in the mail every week. And she kept up with her hometown. And when I wrote my book on Van Buren, she got a copy of it. She got my address and my phone number. She conned somebody even giving them my cell phone number, and she called me one day. And I said, hello? And she said, this is Charlotte Faber Knox. And I said, yes, ma'am. I know who you are. I said, you probably got problems with my book, don't you? Because I figured she knows the town better than I do. She goes, no, I loved your book. But she said, you have one problem. I have a photograph. I didn't bring it, but I have a photograph of a man sitting on Mount Vista, the bluffs up above Van Buren, above Lee Creek. And in the photograph, I didn't know who he was, but it was a turn-of-the-century photo. He's sharply dressed. He's got a derby on. He's got a coat and tie, and he's sitting there getting his picture made on the side of the bluff. I said, unknown man, Lee Creek Bluff, also known as Mount Vista, Van Buren, Arkansas. And she said, that man that you say is unknown? She goes, he's not unknown. I said, well, who is he? She said, that's my father. So I've got her father on the cover of my book on Van Buren, which is kind of cool. But that's him driving Lady Liberty in the Strawberry Parade on Van Buren Main Street. And I love that. So here's John Bell's Main Street picture. I've kind of set you up for it, but it's the same sort of perspective. You've already seen this before, but it's actually after the automobile era. You can see the trolley tracks. You can see the brick street and the depot and all the details, and the Citizens Bank building and the Crawford County Bank building right there. So lots of things going on in this picture. It was kind of an overcast, cloudy day. It's been raining, and that's a fun part of this. She pointed out a lot of other stuff that I won't repeat, but you got great detail, and that's a fun painting to go look at and really study upstairs. That gets us to the King Opera House, and like I said, the Regional Art Museum does not have a copy of this, and we're going to fix that somehow. I don't know how yet, but we're going to fix it, and we got to get the King Opera House over here. So the King Opera House was built in 1891. It was originally built as a part of a block of buildings called the Wallace Block. Wallace and his family are all buried in Fairview Cemetery. Wallace was a grocery store owner and a trader on the river, and a very prominent businessman in Van Buren and Crawford County history. Eventually, H.P. King shows up and he converts the northeast end of the Wallace Block into an opera house in 1901. So you have vaudeville shows. This is the vaudeville era. So they're doing music and drama and comedy and variety. It's kind of like the Carol Burnett show with all kinds of activities live in front of an audience all the time. And that's what most of the shows were. They did some Shakespeare and some other things in there, but it was primarily vaudeville acts that appeared there. In 1905, they added a balcony, but again, Van Buren is not Fort Smith. Doesn't have a population, And eventually what happens is they're having trouble getting the theater filled, and they end up going out of the theater business. They lease the front of the box office and the lobby to a dry cleaners. And they were cleaning clothes in there, and laundry and dry cleaning. And one of the laundresses left a hot iron going and went home one night, and the front of the building caught on fire and it burned. And we had trouble there, and it took them a while to get it repaired. And so it partially burned. Didn't burn the whole building down, but it burned part of it. It had to be remodeled. But what happens in the 1920s is they convert it to a movie theater. And most people in Van Buren know the history of it as the Bob Burns Theater, when it was a movie house. And I'm going to show you some pictures of that too. I have one historic photo, and it's poor. And I'm embarrassed to even show it to you, but it's the only one I can find historically of the King Opera House, when it was the King Opera House before it was Bob Burns Theater. And I know this is pretty early because you've got a horse-drawn carriage out front right there, and I believe the streets are dirt at that point still. So this is historic, but it's a horrible image. And I've tried to find the parent image of that's in good quality, but I can't find it anywhere. So we have to deal with the distortion. But that's the earliest picture of the King Opera House I've ever seen. And then that gets us. There's a contemporary. This is what it looks like today. So I want to let you see that, and then I want to go back. So they did a good job of putting all this back together. The windows at the top, especially, they had to do quite a bit of work. And the same general contractor. I'm not selling contracts today, but Crawford Construction is a Van Buren construction company, and they did all the work at Drennen-Scott for the university, and they did all the work at the Wilhoff House. They did the work on King Opera House too. They've done a lot of historic restoration. They did the work for the National Park Service after the tornado on Judge Parker's courthouse too. So they've got a lot of experience with that. Here it is. Here's the same building. Again, we're talking about this as the Bob Burns Theater, probably in the 30s, according to the cars. Drummond's Revenge was the movie. I'm going to have to look that up and see what that is. It was a double feature. We don't know what the second feature was on the other side. A what? It says Bulldog. Yeah, Bulldog. Oh, there you go. It's up above there. Bulldog and Drummond's Revenge. Okay. Here is Uncle Hank and Uncle George viewing the city of Van Buren, which is also the home of Bob Burns, with Bob Burns Theater right behind them. And the reason I'm talking like that is because Bob Burns made millions of dollars talking like that about his cousins in Arkansas, making fun of those folks. And a lot of us don't really like that a whole lot because he made us all out to be a bunch of hicks. And Bob Burns, he's got some followers and some friends, but some people are like, And Van Buren lays claim to Bob Burns because he lived a big chunk of his life there. But the thing that you don't know about Bob Burns, this is kind of typical. He was born in Greenwood. There you go.
It says Mickey Rooney on it.
Mickey Rooney was on the film there for that one. Here's a colored postcard image of the Bob Burns Theater with another double feature going on, and it's comfortably cool inside there. So there you go. Again, in the 30s, according to the vehicles. This is a postcard image. I like the OG&E sign over there on the opposite side of the street. And again, the depot up the avenue. So John Bell's street view is coming back to haunt us here too. And then here's John Bell's King Opera House picture, which you haven't seen yet today because, again, Ram doesn't have one yet. But we're going to fix that. We're going to find a way to fix that. And this is what it looks like. And should I tell you? Should I let you in on the secret?
Oh.
That's my outline in the glass photo frame that the print is in. Because I had to struggle to get an image of it myself. And we didn't have time to break a frame down and take it out so I could lose the glass image. So that's me taking a picture of that picture, okay? We go to great lengths to make sure that you get a good program. And the sacrifices are great here. So anyway, there's a little bit of glare there. I apologize for that. But we'll eventually have a good version of this over here with all the other John Bell paintings. But he painted that in 2004. It's interesting that he chose Hamlet as the play that was being there because, again, the typical play was a vaudeville show. But this is, again, before automobile era. The streets are dirt, you can tell. and a lot of neat things going on there. Very similar to that picture, that oldest picture I showed you. So I almost believe he probably got some inspiration from that early picture because it was around probably.